Welcome to another episode of Regulatory Oversight, a podcast that focuses on providing expert perspective on trends that drive regulatory enforcement activity. I'm Stephen Peepgrass, one of the hosts of the podcast and the leader of the firm's Regulatory Investigations, Strategy, and Enforcement Practice Group. This podcast features insights from members of our practice group, including its nationally ranked state attorneys general team, as well as guest commentary from business leaders, regulatory experts, and current and former government officials. We cover a wide range of topics affecting businesses operating in highly regulated areas. Before we get started today, I want to remind all of our listeners to visit and subscribe to our blog at regulatoryoversight.com so you can stay up to date on developments and changes in the regulatory landscape. Today, my colleague David Dove speaks with the Attorney General of Georgia, Chris Carr, on a variety of topics, including General Carr's early career in Washington, D.C., how his experiences have shaped his perspective as Attorney General, the intricacies of federal rulemaking, and his current role. David is a leading member of our Regulatory Investigations, Strategy, and Enforcement Practice and heads up our Regulatory and Economic Investment Practice in Georgia. Before joining us, David had extensive leadership experience in state government, culminating in his role as executive counsel to Georgia Governor Brian Kemp. One of his significant victories in that role involved collaborating with Attorney General Carr and his office in the tri-state water wars. General Carr serves as the 49th Attorney General of Georgia. Since assuming office in 2016, he has prioritized combating human trafficking, gang activity, opioid misuse, elder abuse, and consumer fraud. David and General Carr, I know we are very much looking forward to your discussion.
Stephen, thank you so much for that introduction. We're really excited to have on the podcast today the Attorney General of the state of Georgia, Chris Carr. Mr. Attorney General, thank you for joining us.
David, it is a thrill to be with you. Thank you so much for asking me to be on the podcast with you.
We're excited to have you. By way of introduction to our listeners, obviously you and I have known each other for some time. When I worked in the governor's office before coming over to Troutman, I always told people we had a very great relationship with our Attorney General's office, working on many issues with you and your staff. And so it is great to have you on. And I'm excited for our listeners to hear about what all your office has been undertaking over the last several years and to hear from you on several of these points as it relates to initiatives in your office.
Well, I'm excited about it. And you're very kind. We've had a great relationship, known you for a long time. Very fortunate, I think, from the state's perspective to have that relationship, because I don't know that that happens all over the country. But in Georgia, the governor's office, the AG's office, you as executive counsel, we're very, very fortunate with that working relationship, and I'm grateful for it.
Yeah, I am as well. We'll jump right in. I know a lot of people may not know this about you, but you actually have a long career in public service, going back to some time in D.C. and then working in other executive branch agencies. How does that experience impact the way that you view your role as Attorney General?
Well, that's actually an interesting question. And I got the good fortune to serve as Deputy Chief of Staff and Chief of Staff to Senator Johnny Isakson for many years, a little over 10 years. And then Governor Nathan Deal, who you worked with once upon a time as well, appointed me Commissioner of Economic Development. And one of the things that I think is a little bit different is a lot of my colleagues, a lot of my AG colleagues around the country came from private practice, or maybe they came from the prosecution world. Well, I came from the legislative side on the federal side, and then economic development. And look, private practice and being a prosecutor are critically important skill sets. But I was always coming at things from a how do you bring folks together? How do you solve problems kind of perspective, and a little bit of a different skill set. And I think it's been valuable as we'll talk, I know, probably down the road, but as we've tried to shift the focus of this office a little bit, we've tried to it's our job to uphold the rule of law, but also I think Georgia's a pro-business environment. And I've always tried to say that whether you're an individual in this state or you're a good corporate citizen, you deserve to have us know the facts as well as the law, and those relationships matter. But I think, working with Isakson on federal issues and AGs now doing more and more in the federal space, these are all issues, whether they're environmental or as it relates to business issues or immigration, whatever it may be. All these issues we got a chance to work on before. And then with Governor Deal, he'd spent time in DC, but then also in the legislature, and being pro-business and encouraging us to go find that next job and that next dollar of investment, I think was critical. So dealing with federal issues, but then also seeing the impact of laws, regulatory policy, tax policy on business was critically important as well. So being the lawyers for the state from a civil perspective, and then now from a criminal perspective, I think it's just provided a unique opportunity for me.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I can imagine there's a lot of overlap between particularly issues of national importance and dealing with those while in the Senate, as well as dealing with those now that you're Attorney General in Georgia. Talk through, I know we've worked together on water wars and all these other issues that are kind of broad national concern that are acute issues within your office. How does that background work with your decision making as Attorney General?
Well, yeah, I think one is the familiarity with the issues, number one. And then number two, you've got to be able to partner on a lot of these. And David, you appreciate this too, having worked in the governor's office, but having worked with the federal delegation as well. Kind of the way that I've seen it is the way things are going in Washington right now, in particular, nature of war is a vacuum. And if Congress doesn't do, it's supposed to be first among equals. And if they don't pass laws, then that vacuum gets filled by the federal executive through executive order, regulation, whatever it may be. And so you've seen this over the course of the last 2 decades where state AGs in particular, governors as well, have been the pushback that if Congress isn't going to do it in our federal system, the states are in a good position to push back, and AGs are in kind of the best position as the chief legal officers for their states. So having an understanding of those issues over a decade working in Washington, then having seen it and to be able to work with the governor, 2 governors, Deal and Kemp, work with the legislature and understanding what's important, I think from the state's perspective, from a rule of law perspective, I mean, I think it really gave me an incredible viewpoint, incredible perspective on how to deal with these issues.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I mean, looking at how federal regulation has just grown as a body of law over the last couple of decades, I mean, it certainly is a sea change in how the federal government is effectuating policy on a yearly basis. Obviously, in your role, you're having to address that from the state perspective. Is that largely being done through litigation, or what kind of challenges to rulemaking has your office brought against some of these federal regulations?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. It's kind of an all-in approach. I mean, you have everything from what I would have called a dear colleague in Congress, where you're just talking about a policy issue that you might be pushing. There have been comment letters where we're in the rulemaking process that we've either done individually, we've joined other AGs as well. We have filed lawsuits ourselves, we've joined amicus briefs. So it's kind of the whole buffet of options. And again, you're just seeing, I think you've seen it more and more. It used to be that the AGs were kind of behind the scenes and I think very bipartisan and found a lot of issues to deal with. Governors were usually kind of out front, AGs were behind. But as the world has become more partisan, so is the AG world. But as the world's become more partisan, and again, as Washington gets less and less done, you're just seeing administrations in both parties that if they can't get it done in Congress, or they're not willing to go to Congress, then they're going to take a shot at passing a reg or go through the rulemaking process. So you have to be, as an attorney general, willing to partner with others, and you've got to be willing to use all the arrows in the quiver in our federal system to uphold the rule of law.
Absolutely. So to that end, I'm sure our listeners would love to hear about some of the cases that you've felt like mandated a state response, particularly in this space of federal rulemaking.
Well, yeah, one of the issues you and I dealt with a lot. I mean, you're one of the experts on that, and that's water wars and the water issues of waters of the U.S. We joined with West Virginia. Yeah, it's funny, David, you'll appreciate this. Waters of the U.S. rule. It started off in the Obama years, and then we sued. And then in the Trump years, we kind of worked with the administration and Congress to, we thought, put forth a policy that made sense. Then in the Biden administration, it's kind of come back. I'm a big movie buff. It's kind of like one of those Halloween movies. You keep killing Michael Myers and he keeps coming back. Well, the waters of the U.S. is kind of like the Michael Myers of rulemaking. So that's one issue. EPA's power plant rule, the Clean Power Plan, we worked on those issues. The power plant rule right now, I mean, just basically, again, sets unrealistic timelines. In Georgia, we have reliable and low cost energy, and that has been one of our strengths as it relates to economic development. Well, the EPA's got a new rule that's going to be costly and, in our opinion, just unattainable from an emission standard perspective. The SEC has a climate disclosure rule. I mean, everything now, again, what we've kind of seen is from this current administration, the Biden administration, has had to do with climate change. Well, now you've got the SEC, who's got a climate disclosure rule that basically requires companies to produce all kinds of documents that include weather reports and climate risks and things that go way outside the scope of what the SEC is tasked with doing. So those are some of the issues. NEPA, that's another one, the National Environmental Policy Act, creating, what we think are roadblocks to infrastructure projects. And in Georgia, as well as elsewhere, but, again, infrastructure is critically important when you have the busiest airport in the world and you have the fastest growing port. Logistics is part of your lifeblood. There's a number of issues. The business issues have really been the issues that I'm passionate about and have enjoyed working with others on. And it looks like this is kind of the trend for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And not to mention your success in a lot of those issues as well, in terms of being able to get injunctions, or in the case of water wars, your office winning 9-0 before the U.S. Supreme Court after it was litigated before the special master. I mean, I've got to imagine that you've seen federal agencies change tactics in how they go about rulemaking based on some of these, whether it's lawsuits or comment letters or dear colleague letters, some of this engagement that they've seen from your office and other state AGs.
Yeah, I've mentioned the SEC climate disclosure rule. I mean, the fact that we've pushed back, and others as well, I'm sure, but the fact we pushed back, the SEC issued a temporary stay on that rule. So we've seen success. On the other side of the coin, though, one of the things that we've seen, and I think we have been very effective, and again, it's turned more partisan in nature over the last decade or decade and a half, which kind of is what it is. But as it relates to recently, we've had a lot of success litigating. We've had some success as well in the rulemaking process. But one of the things that we're seeing that's gotten a little bit frustrating, because is what I said, it goes back. If you're not going to Congress, and if Congress isn't going to address the issues, then there's just this incentive for the federal executive to just continue the rulemaking process, which ends up being pretty political in nature, in my opinion. And you can say that probably on both sides. But what happens is we prevail, we win in court, we get a change effectuated, and then the administration will come back and just change one or two or three words. And then we're kind of back at it again, which I don't know that that's the way that the process was intended to go. But be that as it may, we've seen changes. I've seen changes I'm in my 8th year now as Attorney General, and since 2016, I've seen changes that have occurred just in the approach to a lot of these issues.
I could imagine. Shifting gears a little bit, because I definitely want to touch on this. One of your biggest responsibilities as law enforcement officer for the state, chief law enforcement officer for the state, is prosecuting crimes. And we live in an age now where, as our economy is growing, creating new facets and industries, crime grows with that. So what do you see as being some of the key areas that state attorneys general have to prosecute in new areas of law that may not have been around 10 or 20 years ago?
Well, and this is where I think, and this because you're a part of it, and I can't thank Governor Kemp and the legislature enough for having the foresight and the support so that we could all partner on these issues. But again, in Georgia, the AG was largely a civil practice, and we tried to do excellent work representing the agencies, boards, and the authorities that comprise state government, do it the best of our ability. But really going back to 2017, 2018 timeframe, and then beyond, the office has really become a very vibrant and effective criminal practice too. So 17, we got the authority over domestic terrorism. 2019, again, working with the First Lady, with the governor, the legislature, the authority over human trafficking. 2022, over statewide gang activity, which is critically important when 60 to 90% of all violent crime is gang affiliated, and all Georgians deserve to be safe. And this is not just a public safety issue, it's an economic development issue, which has been critically important in our state. And now organized retail crime. So now you've got organized groups of people that are hitting brick and mortar retail, whereas it used to be you go to the pawn shop and sell it. Now you're selling it online. Now it's become a big issue both for big box retailers as well as for mom and pops. But I think, again, I'm really proud of what we've done in Georgia collectively. And again, from the governor's office to the legislature to our office, but then also federal, state, and local law enforcement working together on these issues. And I think, again, one issue of great importance, I think, to the business community in particular is this issue of organized retail crime. I mean, everything from, you've seen the stories nationwide on the smash and grabs, you've seen people going into malls, but it's also CVS's and Walgreens and Home Depots and Lowe's, but PGA superstores, industrial strength pallets. We've got a company in Alpharetta, Georgia that found a bunch of pallets out in New Mexico. And so these are the issues that I think are of statewide importance. And yes, they are public safety issues, but they are also economic development issues. And I've said this before, no company is going to locate in a place they don't feel safe. You're not going to expand your customer base in a place you don't feel safe. You're not going to go to great sporting events like the World Cup we're about to have or SEC championship if people don't feel safe. And so this to me is a critically important public safety as well as economic development issue. And I'm proud that we're working together on it.
No, I'm glad you made the point about it being an economic development issue because, I think it's very easy to take for granted what the dollar amounts are that some of these corporations are seeing. I was thinking about this conversation this weekend when I was at Home Depot and the modifications they've made to the store with the placement of registers, turnstiles when you go in, things to prevent somebody from walking out with, a piece of lawn equipment or something else. I mean, it's really affecting these both retail industries as well as in different types of industry and manufacturing as well. And so, I mean, it's to that point about the economic development. I mean, it's critically important, and particularly here in Georgia, certainly glad that your office is on top of that and getting those prosecutions moving, because I know it means a lot to our business community here. Along with that, I know you mentioned human trafficking too. This is something that we obviously worked a lot together with your partnership with First Lady Marty Kemp in the governor's office. But I mean, Georgia's really been a champion for this area of preventing human trafficking and rescuing survivors from the grip of this ugly industry. Could you tell our listeners a little bit more about some of the things that you're doing through the human trafficking unit in your office and how that battle's being won in Georgia?
Yeah, well, I'm so proud of the team that we have, but when you really look at it, David, you hit the nail on the head. When First Lady Marty Kemp came into office, even before they came into office, we did an event on human trafficking. And the First Lady brought together what's called the Grace Commission in Georgia. And so she really brought together all the different partners, whether it's prosecutors, it's nonprofits, it's those that are involved in restoration, policymakers, brought everybody around to the table and said, how do we address this issue? So we've got the piece of the prosecution side, a little bit on the training side too. But oftentimes people say because of Atlanta, because of Hartsfield, Georgia, the number one state for human trafficking. Well, nobody knows. It's really hard to get the data, whether it's federal data or state level or around the country. But I know this, Georgia has become the number one state to address and beat the human trafficking game, which has become just a horrific industry. And so we started off in 2019 with the support of the governor, First Lady, and the legislature, and we have really developed relationships. We've just last year alone rescued and assisted 129 victims. Since January of last year, we've convicted 30 individuals. In fact, as this issue gets sicker and sicker all the time, but we just had a conviction for an individual that was trafficking a disabled adult. We've seen parents that are selling their children for drug money. It's just awful. But the fact that we've all come together and recognizing, it's kind of like with gang activity. I always say, who are the communities most often terrorized by gangs? It's lower income, racially diverse, and immigrant populations. Well, who are the communities that are most vulnerable to human trafficking? Lower income, racially diverse, immigrant populations. And we've really come together as a state. And we were talking about this in the office today. I mean, our prosecution team has done an unbelievable job and constantly coming forth with folks that are taking, these plea deals. And we've had a couple of trials and we've been very successful, still got 100% success rate. But I'm really proud of Georgia. I mean, there are a lot of states that have focused on this issue, but what I think we have done in the last 5 years collectively is really a model for the nation, and I'm proud of it.
Well, I think you're exactly right. I mean, when you look at national leaders in this space in terms of prosecuting crimes and passing new statutes to deal with new tactics, I mean, Georgia is really at the tip of the spear, and you and your office have certainly been a huge part of that with bringing down these trafficking rings and these people engaging in this industry. We've talked about a lot in terms of new areas, new concerns. I mean, I got to imagine as an attorney general sitting here in 2024, there have got to be a lot of things that are coming down the pike in terms of new concerns for not only regulation, but also criminal behavior and other challenges that are going to face attorneys general offices across the country over the next 5, 10, 20 years. I mean, how are you perceiving those challenges, new threats, and what is your office doing to prepare Georgia for those?
Well, one of the issues we've kind of mentioned, I think, is organized retail crime. Again, what I think has gone from a local, going to the pawn shop type thing to really a national and multinational issue that needs to be addressed. And I think that's an area where we can work together more collectively as states and as attorneys general. I'm the head of the organized retail crime task force for the Attorney General Association with General Kwame Raoul from Illinois. And this is just an important issue that I think certainly in the short term, because it impacts so many different industries. But I'll tell you the two issues that kind of keep me awake at night are AI and cyber crimes, cybersecurity. We're dealing a little bit with cyber crimes, obviously with scams and that type of thing. And we know a lot of folks are individuals that are overseas, or they're state actors, or they're organized, crime syndicates. But that's an issue. We've partnered with our federal, you got to have the federal government, you got to have federal law enforcement anytime you're talking about cybersecurity. And we've created a task force in the Northern District of Georgia. We've tried to do some training programs in our office with guides for older adults and that type of thing. And then AI is just new to all of us. And I mean, this is an area you worked on in the governor's office and Secretary of State as it relates to elections, as it relates to scams. I mean, one of the biggest scams that we see is a grandchild scam, where someone will call in and a grandparent will say, "Chris, is that you?" And they'll say, "Yeah, this is me. I need you to send me money." Well, with AI, all they need now is my picture on social media, my voice, and it actually really does sound like me. You can see where that goes in a number of different areas that really worry me. And so we got to educate ourselves. We got to find those partnerships. So we got to prepare to the best of our ability. But I really do think those are areas where the states can work together. We need our federal partners to be focusing on these issues too. And those are AI and cyber continue to keep me awake at night.
No, I can imagine. I mean, just that scam hypothetical that you outlined there. I mean, that is something that is real and something that is a scary thing to think about, particularly, as we have to protect our elderly populations. Well, Attorney General, thank you. I'm afraid we're out of time for today, but I really appreciate you coming on and talking to our listeners about the issues that you're dealing with in your office, and really appreciate you taking the time.
Well, David, I want to thank you and Stephen and Ashley and Troutman Pepper. Thank you for having me on, and thanks for what y'all do. And this has been a lot of fun. Thanks.
Thank you.
David and General Carr, thank you for your enlightening discussion and insights into the workings of the Georgia Attorney General's office. We really appreciate you joining us today, and I'm sure our listeners enjoyed your engaging dialogue and perspectives as much as I did. And thank you to our listeners for joining us. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast on your preferred platform, be it Apple Podcast, Google Play, Stitcher, or any other. We look forward to having you join us next time.
Copyright Troutman Pepper Hamilton Sanders, LLP. These recorded materials are designed for educational purposes only. This podcast is not legal advice and does not create an attorney-client relationship. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individual participants. Troutman Pepper does not make any representations or warranties, express or implied, regarding the contents of this podcast. Information on previous case results does not guarantee a similar future result. Users of this podcast may save and use the podcast only for personal or other non-commercial educational purposes. No other use, including, without limitation, reproduction, retransmission, or editing of this podcast may be made without the prior written permission of Troutman Pepper. If you have any questions, please contact us at troutman.com.